Alrighty, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 5, where we are going to talk about business communication. So, we are going to talk about all things related to communication in business, right? So, everything is based around communication, whether that be communicating to your employees, to your manager, customers, outside of the business, communicating with your spouse, your significant other, your family, your friends. Everything revolves around communication. So we are going to learn about some excellent communication skills. So most of your success in business might actually depend on your ability to influence the people around you. Now that sounds bad on the surface, but essentially it means, can you land the job, right? Can you close the deal? Your personality is going to carry you further than just saying I went to college, right? Because lots of people go to college, lots of people get the degree. However, it's going to boil down to, what do you have to offer this company? Sure, you have a piece of paper that says you got your bachelor's in business administration or bachelor's in accounting, but we want someone who can take it to the next step and actually influence people like customers or fellow coworkers, right? So, what are considered excellent communication skills, you might be asking? Well, that's a great question. So, great communication equates to being able to speak well and write well, right? You need to speak well and write well, but that isn't all, right? Effective communication happens only when you transmit the meaning to your audience. So, I could be saying all these great words to you as the viewer, as someone in my class, but if you're not getting the message, well, then that's a problem, right? Then I am failing at communicating with you. And communications, they're going to be dynamic, right? They need to be fluid and they need to be two ways. If you're engaging in a conversation with somebody, they need to be, first off, engaged with you. So they need to actually be engaging with you, and you need to be engaging with them. You can't just dominate a conversation. You need to actually listen and respond to them appropriately. So let's talk about some communication barriers, right? So effective communication is easy in our heads, right? It's super easy to think, I could go out there and talk to anybody, right? But in practice, it's actually a lot more difficult. In my mind, I could go out there and schmooze anybody. But in the real world, I can't go out there and schmooze everybody, right? So why is it so challenging? Well, that's because of something called noise. And nope, we're not talking about physical sound, right? Although we could be, but noise is any interference that causes the message you send to be different from the message received, right? So this could be poor choice of words, right? Or, in other words, communication barriers, right? It could be obstacles to effective communication, typically defined in terms of physical, language, cultural, perceptual, and organizational barriers. So, physical language, do you speak English? For me, I need you to speak English. I don't speak another language. But if you're speaking to me in German or Spanish or Chinese or whatever language you could think of, there's going to be a communication barrier right there. Culturally, I'm from the United States, and if you are from Mexico, or if you are from England, or you are from Australia or India, you might culturally have different beliefs within your culture that are different from mine. So I may go shake your hand, or I may say a metaphor to you that'll either go right over your head or might actually be insulting to you, right? And that's going to depend on each situation. So that's another type of barrier that could exist. So why do some of these barriers exist? We have physical barriers, right? Maybe it's distance that's the issue, right? It can be documents that we write that look like a wall of text, right? If I put this entire lecture into a Word document, it would be a massive, over 2,000 word wall of text that would be extremely hard to actually learn anything from, right? My message would be lost. Language barriers, like I said, do you speak the same language? Do we speak the same dialect even, right? Dialect could also be an issue when it comes to communicating. Body language, even if our words are inviting, the wrong body language can actually alienate someone, right? So, I could be very friendly and cordial to you in person, but if I'm standing to you asking you how your weekend was, why I have my fists raised in the air in a fighting stance, that will probably put you on edge, won't it, right? So you have to make your body language open and inviting, relaxed, hands by your side, making eye contact, shaking your head to acknowledge that you're actually paying attention, right? Being inviting. You have perceptual barriers, organizational barriers, and then cultural barriers, as I described before. So that brings us to nonverbal communication. So most of us focus on what we want to say, right? The words that we want to say. But what we need to focus on is how we say it. In face-to-face communication, your body language and tone of voice are just as impactful as the words that you use. They can be just as impactful as the words that you use. So having good nonverbal communication is super important, right? Because nonverbal communication is communication that does not use words, right? You don't need words. Common forms are gestures like shaking your hand, making eye contact, your tone of voice, facial expressions, things like that. Not only do you need to understand and control your body language, but you also need to accurately interpret other people's body language. So, if we're having a conversation and I start to clench my fist and grit my teeth and frown my eyebrows, well, then you might think what I'm saying is clearly upsetting this person. It's clearly upsetting the person I'm communicating with. So that'll change up the conversation based on that. Something that you need to engage in is called active listening, which is an attentive listening that occurs when the listener focuses on their complete attention on the speaker. I'm actively trying to listen to you. You'll find that the higher up in your organization you go, the more they are willing to listen to you. So if you join Walmart headquarters, wherever they're based, as a maintenance worker, I'm sure that the Walton family is probably not going to really want to take your opinions into account. But if you work your way up to the CFO of the organization, Walmart as a whole, well, they're more likely to actually listen to you, huh? So the more you actively listen, the better you're going to be engaged, and the more capable you are at engaging other people's. Studies show us that 85% of learning is actually derived from listening. Yet listeners are still distracted and forgetful and preoccupied about 75% of the time. So what's the gap here? Well, most listeners hear on average 250 to 300 words per minute, but they actually think, and this is astounding, they actually think about 1,000 to 3,000 words per minute. So all those thoughts racing in your mind, it's not just you. It's me and all your other classmates. You might hear me speak 300 words in 1 minute, yet you've heard mine, and you've heard another 2,700 words. So when you listen, you need to try and focus yourself to pay attention very clearly. You need to be deliberate in your communication. You need to make yourself pay more close attention. And it's not just you, it's me as well. I need to improve myself with stuff like that. Everybody needs to improve. So here's some tips for better listening. Some do's: use extra mental capacity to summarize to yourself what the speaker is saying. So essentially, when I say something, if you wanted to listen better, you would try and take my words and reiterate them to yourself. Take a few notes. It'll help you concentrate, right? But you don't want to focus solely on writing notes, because you want to focus on the words being said. The notes are kind of a reference back. Listen with both your ears and your eyes. So you're clearly giving me your ear, but making eye contact and showing me you're paying attention is another great body language, right? It's another great way to show the speaker that they have your attention. Use nonverbal communication like nods, smiles, leaning forward to indicate interest in the speaker, right? To show them you're actually interested. And give feedback or feedback questions to indicate understanding and empathy. So let's talk about something called communication channels. So communication channels is figuring out the right way to send your message, right? It can be a daunting challenge. Communication channel is the various ways in which a message can be sent, ranging from one-on-one in-person meetings to internet-based messaging boards, right? Such as iMessage or email or AIM. I don't know. You're probably all too young to know AIM, but that was another big one back in the day. So, what are some common communication channels that you guys use? Well, you have texting, you have memos and reports, such as a document sent out from your workplace. You have email, you have your voicemail, right? And you can see there a couple different ways in which you can improve that communication. You have telephone conversations, even though everybody hates doing telephone conversations anymore. That's still a very effective way to actually communicate information. You have video conferencing, in-person presentations, and face-to-face meetings. So, the dramatic rise of video conferencing. This was a huge thing that happened because of COVID-19. Everything shut down, and you probably took some classes, whether that be in high school or in college, online asynchronously, where you had to meet via Teams, as that was the primary source of communication, right? Or Zoom or another sort of online platform. It was the main source of communication, right? Throughout the pandemic, we learned a lot. We got a lot better, right? So throughout the trial and error, some best practices have emerged. So some of those best practices are try to keep your video camera on because that helps build trust and more personal connections. You should mute your audio when not speaking. You should find a simple distraction-free background from your camera. I'm looking at you, the people that use the very explosive in-your-face Minecraft background, right? Try and find something a little bit more simple and plain so it's not so distracting. Position yourself with light in front of your face so that way they can clearly see you and you don't look like Batman. My office currently makes me look like Batman when I'm on a meeting because the window is behind me. Keep your eyes on the camera. Do your best not to multitask. It's very easy to get distracted with your cell phone. Try not to. And maintain professional clothing and demeanor. You probably shouldn't show up to your work meeting with a sweatshirt and sweatpants on, right? So, up next, you need to consider the audience when you're communicating with people. So, consider the audience's needs, right? And attempt to meet them in the middle. Meaning try and accommodate them as best as possible, right? So figure out, what does your audience need from this? What do you need to provide to them as the speaker, right? And you need to attempt to meet them somewhere within their skill base, right? So maybe they're really bad at telecommunication. Maybe you try and make it as simple as possible. Just a video, maybe a PowerPoint, right? Versus someone who's very tech savvy, a group that's very tech savvy. Maybe you want to make it more interactive with different kinds of questions, right? Up next, you want to pick the right words. Picking the right words is super important, right? You need to write for your audience, right? So the same words or message will be written differently from someone who is 5 years of age versus someone who's 25 years of age, just graduated college, right? Your messaging is going to be much different between those two age groups. Up next, you need to analyze your audience, right? So to find those right words and to choose those right words, you need to actually consider your audience, right? You need to be considerate. So consider their expectations. What kind of language do most people use in the organization that you're trying to study or engage in? Is it formal and direct? Should you defer from the norm or maintain the status quo? Those are things you need to consider. Their education. What's the education level, right? Someone who only has a high school degree versus someone who has a PhD in their field, right, is going to use different type of language, right? Meeting their needs. And then profession. What audience are you speaking to? Is it appropriate to use acronyms? Or how does this influence your message, right? If you're working with someone who actively engages in political campaigns and different government-based organizations, well, then you can use government acronyms as they should know what they are. Versus if you go to just any workplace and want to talk about HIPAA compliance or the IRS, right? You might need to not abbreviate. You might need to explain what the IRS is to them. Up next, You want to really try and avoid bias. So bias is a preconception about members of a particular group. So 3 common forms of bias are gender bias, age bias, and race and ethnicity bias. And there's been a much bigger push for these biases, or a much bigger push of understanding of these biases over the last few years, right? Since the pandemic happened. So gender bias are any stereotypical attitudes towards a specific gender, right? So male, female, or anyone outside of those 2 categories. You have age bias, which is stereotypical attitudes towards people of specific ages. And then you have race bias, which is stereotypical attitude towards people of specific... Why do they all say specific ages? I'm so sorry. Of a specific race. My apologies on that. So race bias, once again, is stereotypical attitudes towards people of a specific race or ethnicity. So, what does this mean? It means you need to use your active voice and write your high impact message. You need to deliver that message and nail it home with your audience. So using an active voice is when the subject of your sentence is doing the action described by the verb, right? You're actively engaging, you're actively showing what you're saying. Be sure to write your words to be as impactful as possible. Adding a bunch of technical jargon in there is just going to do nothing but sway you away from what you're actually trying to say, right? Versus, getting right to the point, right? And using as few words as possible. And what I'll say is a commercial we've probably all seen before is the dog adoption organization with the Sarah McLachlan dog commercial, In the Arms of the Angel, right? Very few words actually said by the narrator, but it's such an impactful message. I'm gonna cry just thinking about it, right? That is impactful versus if they wrote you 7 books on the topic of adoption, right? So I hope you learned something about communication, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.